Okay, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening. My name is Joe Glauber. I'm a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute and interim secretary for the Agricultural Market Information System, or AMIS. And I want to welcome you to another joint AMIS-IFPRI webinar, this one on global crop prospects for the Northern Hemisphere. I'm very excited about this session. We're coming into a new crop year with a lot of uncertainties. The war in Ukraine continues, with rumblings that the Black Sea Grain Initiative could be suspended and tensions over Ukraine grain and oilseeds moving to neighboring countries to the west. Global stocks remain tight, and reduced plantings in Ukraine mean that other countries will need to produce additional grains and oilseeds to help rebuild global stocks and moderate price levels. And we have continued drought in some key regions around the world: Argentina, this year, the southern plains of the US and North Africa, and with a likely El Nino event occurring later this year. But today we're going to focus on crop prospects in the Northern Hemisphere. Experts will address crop and weather conditions in key wheat, corn, and oilseed producing regions, including the US and Canada, the EU and the Black Sea, North Africa, and China. We have a great panel. With our speakers include Brian Barker, who will be speaking on global crop conditions. Brian is a geospatial scientist with the Global Agricultural Monitoring, or GEOGLAM. GEOGLAM has been, since the founding of AMIS, has been a member of the AMIS Secretariat. He'll be followed by Brad Rippey, who I'm pleased to will be joining us. Brad is an agricultural meteorologist and U.S. analyst and drought monitor author for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and has extensive experience as a meteorologist working on agricultural crop conditions. He's going to be talking about weather prospects in the Northern Hemisphere. And then we're going to turn to three analysts, top flight analysts, I think, that will talk about production and supply and demand prospects. First, treating the US and Canada will be Angie Setzer. Angie, we've had on on previous webinars. She's a partner with Consus ROI. And again, she'll be talking about the US and Canada. She will be followed by Aurélien Blary, who's with grains analyst with Stratégie Grain. He will be talking about the EU and North African production prospects. And then lastly, we're pleased that Andrey Sizov, who's the managing director of SovEcon, will be with us. He'll be talking about Russia and Black Sea production prospects. After that, we're going to turn it to like we always do, turn it to a moderated discussion with the panelists and accept Q&As from the audience. That's going to be moderated by Seth Meyer, who's you know from previous webinars. Seth is the chief economist at USDA and currently is the chair of AMIS. And also Erin, who's also been on a few times in the past. She's an economist with the Markets Trade Division at the Food and Agriculture Organization and is our chief grains analyst for the AMIS Market Monitor. And then lastly, we are eager to hear from you. So we will be taking your questions and integrating them into the discussion. To participate in the Q&A session, submit your questions on IFPRI.org, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or by using the hashtag AskIFPRI on Twitter. Okay, with that, I'm going to move right to Brian. Brian, if you can start us off with a discussion of the global crop conditions.
Thank you very much, Joe. I'll wait till the PowerPoint gets up. All right. Thank you very much. I'm going to talk about current crop conditions with a real focus on the Northern Hemisphere winter wheat. Next slide, please. All right, looking at global crop conditions right now, as you can see, Northern Hemisphere, the main issues we're looking at is just wheat in the season. Sowing is just beginning right now for corn and soy. Winter wheat issues, we're focusing on the main areas, looking at Central Asia, In Europe, we're looking at Ukraine and possibly some other issues developing in Southern Europe. North Africa is a big hotspot right now. And then obviously transitioning to North America, we're looking at a big hotspot in the Southern and Central Great Plains. Also, other crops well known in the Southern Hemisphere, currently issues in Argentina and parts of Uruguay and Southern Brazil, and also Africa, Eastern and Western Africa are dealing with some dry conditions as well. Next slide, please. Okay, as I did mention, we are looking at the three main areas of issues right now we're talking about is Ukraine, Central Asia, and the Middle East, and North Africa, and then also the US. However, if you hit next slide, please. As you can see from the global production pie chart here, overall conditions are pretty good right now for winter wheat in the Northern Hemisphere. Overall favorable conditions. There are a few hotspots to be worried about and a few things to watch as the season comes near completion. And spring wheat begins sowing later this month. Okay, next please. All right, quickly going through the individual regions. We'll start in South and East Asia. As we can see, favorable conditions here. In China, winter wheat is under generally favorable conditions with a good regrowth, despite some minor areas in the north that received some frost damage during the winter, and some areas with a little bit lacking in rainfall. Now, looking at Pakistan, India, and Nepal, and Bangladesh, we are seeing harvesting beginning. Overall, conditions are favorable for those countries. India did receive some heavy rainfall and hailstorms in March, but those only resulted in some small pockets of damage and lodging in the fields in some states. All right, next slide. All right, Central Asia is where we have some real mixed conditions. As you can see, we have a lot of dry conditions and even some hot conditions in some areas. Overall, winter wheat is in season here, and spring wheat will begin sowing soon in the north, as you can see in Kazakhstan in the north. The main thing to mention right here is in Afghanistan, most parts of the country really experience below average precipitation and snow depth conditions over the winter. And now we're looking at above average temperatures cause snow to melt rapidly in some regions, resulting in minimal levels of snow water volumes to be released later on this year for irrigation. And so the country to watch right here is Afghanistan going forward. Okay, next. All right, in Europe, conditions are generally favorable across most of the continent. However, we do, as most everyone knows, we have ongoing conflict conditions in Ukraine, particularly in the eastern and southern areas. But one thing to do note is that in the south of Ukraine, particularly in Odessa, we are seeing some dry conditions developing, and that may be impacting things. But the nice news for Ukraine is within winter wheat, we did see winter wheat regrowth begin 2 to 3 weeks earlier than average. This will also help give the crop a longer growth period and probably impact some good yields if they're not impacted by the dry conditions or the conflict. In Russia, we did see conditions improve recently. They'd received some sufficient rainfall, particularly in the southern Caucasus, where there were dry conditions before. In Turkey, we do see conditions which are generally favorable, albeit delayed crop due to some late autumn sowings and some cold spells during winter dormancy and overall low soil moisture. So that's one country we want to look forward going ahead, making sure that they're receiving ample rainfall. Another thing to mention is while Europe looks favorable right now, we are seeing some dry conditions developing, particularly in Spain, southern France, Italy. So going forward, we may see those conditions deteriorate if rain is not received. Okay, next slide, please. All right, Middle East and North Africa, this is a really hot spot right now. We're seeing harvesting beginning in some areas this month with really below average yields expected in parts of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, northern Syria, and northern Iraq to persistent dry conditions. Looking at Morocco particularly, we're looking at a large portion of the country experienced below average rainfall during the early parts of the season, particularly in January. While February brought some relief to the northwest region, rainfall was significantly below average again in March. The generally low and sporadic distribution of rain combined with above average winter temperatures are expected to result in below average yields, except for maybe some western areas and central areas. In Algeria, conditions are mostly dry in March and throughout the country, following irregular and below average rainfall early in the season, similar to Morocco. Consequently, winter wheat cereal growth will be much delayed since the start of the season, and crop biomass is really considered below average in most regions, except for maybe along just parts of the northeastern coast. Now in Tunisia, we're really seeing rainfall deficits since October, basically really resulting in one of the most lowest rainfall totals in Tunisia since 2001 and 2002 season. And these dry conditions combined with above average temperatures in the last month have severely impacted crop conditions, especially in the central northern regions of the country, and crop level yields are expected to be significantly below the 5-year average. In Libya, agroclimatic conditions have been relatively good. However, a lot of the crops have really been impacted by the simmering conflict and ongoing social economic challenges, such as seed inputs, access to fertilizers, and other inputs. In Egypt, conditions remain favorable, particularly for the irrigated crops, which are harvesting soon. And then Syria, despite the good rainfall they've really received in the north and south of the country in March, the biomass is once again below average for most of the country, and the ongoing conflict is really continuing to cause problems. Now in Iraq, conditions are favorable in the central and the southern areas of the country due to good rainfall, and we're really seeing above average biomass, which is going to produce some good crops potentially. However, if you look in the north, we're seeing generally poor rainfall performance, particularly in the main cereal producing governorate of Nineveh and also parts of Dahuk and Erbil, which has led to poor conditions. In Iran, we are seeing generally favorable conditions, except for really in the northeast due to some dryness. They did receive some rainfall over the last month and in the central areas, which has really helped crops along the way. All right, next slide, please. In North America, this is an ongoing story, which is really been happening for the last couple of years here. We're seeing drought in particularly since autumn in the main winter wheat producing areas of Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Nebraska, eastern Colorado. And these conditions have been dry for multiple years now. And not only has the surface soil moisture levels been depleted, but we're actually seeing subsurface soil moisture is really being depleted in many areas. Once again, there is a heterogeneous nature over certain areas, and so you will see some fields being quite good, and you'll see a lot of fields where we actually see a good amount of abandonment potentially this year. So rainfall over the next little while will be important. In Canada, conditions are generally favorable for winter wheat. This is really a minor crop for Canada, where spring wheat is the primary crop. That being said, the primary growth for winter wheat is in Ontario, which is seeing good conditions. However, if you look into Saskatchewan, we do have some dry conditions in the fall where it was sown into. So we'll see really how that comes out of spring. And then Mexico conditions are favorable. Going into a spring wheat sowing, it'll be very interesting to watch, particularly if you look at the Red River Valley region up in Manitoba, the Dakotas, and we're going to see potentially flooding, and we'll see how that affects spring wheat sowings. All right, next slide, please. And once again, just giving a summation here, we're looking at overall good conditions for winter wheat in the Northern Hemisphere, except for these spot areas of Ukraine, Central Asia, Middle East, North Africa, and the US. But once again, if you look at the pie chart, these areas which are being impacted are relatively minor in comparison to all the winter wheat we're seeing in the Northern Hemisphere. So we're seeing overall good conditions. All right, next slide. And thank you very much. That ends my intervention.
Great, Brian. Thanks so much. Let me switch here. So we're going to move from the Earth observation data that's tracking biomass to kind of a meteorological outlook and turn to Brad Rippey. Brad, take it over.
All right, thank you, Joe. Let me get my camera turned on here and I will be right with you. All right, thank you. Thank you for the introduction earlier, Joe. And I will be looking at some of the same kind of things that Brian was, but again, as he said, from more of a drought and meteorological perspective. Next slide, please. I will start out with what's most familiar to me as I'm the US analyst at the Office of the Chief Economist. And here's the current drought scenario for the United States, for the continental United States. And even though we've seen significant improvement over the last 5 months, you notice that we still have really punishing drought across the central and southern Great Plains, same areas that Brian highlighted as being really in a watch area. With each passing day, we're seeing more and more concerns related to dryness, wind, blowing dust, wildfire concerns across that region. Now, nationally, we just came out of a very long period, 126 consecutive weeks, where we saw 40% drought coverage. That ended in February. But at present, we're down to 26% drought coverage in the United States, there in that upper box. If you include the abnormally dry areas, that goes up to 47%. But still dramatic change and improvement, especially in the Western United States, from what we saw last autumn. Next slide, please. If you look at that in a historical perspective, just going back to January of 2020, you can see this has been a very long-lasting drought across the United States, especially in the western and central part of the country. We did see that 63% drought coverage as recently as late October of 2022. And again, as I mentioned just a moment ago, that is down to 26% So a really big improvement, but not across the central and southern Great Plains key hard red winter wheat production areas. That will extend to other crops as we move into the spring planting season here in the next few weeks. Next slide, please. This is the U.S. change over the last 5 months. Again, dramatic improvement in the western United States, especially California, the Great Basin, the Southwest. Also some improvement in the southeastern plains and the Mid-South, but actually getting worse in many areas from Nebraska southward through West Texas. Next slide, please. As we expand our horizons a little bit, first look at Canada. Here's the current drought situation in Canada. You will notice there is a fairly extensive area of moderate to severe drought, especially in the western prairies and extending across the Rockies. That is an area to watch. We're still a few weeks away from spring crops in that region. As you move to the east, as Brian mentioned, there is some flood concerns moving from the Red River Valley draining northward into Manitoba. But for the most part, we do have some drought concerns in some of the western production areas in the western prairies of Canada heading into spring. Next slide. And as we head to Mexico, this is kind of an interesting story shaping up here. We actually head into the spring growing season here with a pretty significant drought across much of Mexico and including part of the Southern Plateau Corn Belt, where you see some pretty extensive moderate to severe drought, some pockets of extreme drought D3 in the Northeast and the Southwest. And with El Nino looming, that does portend some additional drought intensification across this part of the world. So I'll have much more on that in a slide or two. Next slide, please. Moving across to Europe, again, kind of focusing on the drought side or the meteorological side of things here. That drought really shows up across Northwest Africa. And then we've got concerns from the Iberian Peninsula kind of extending northeastward, certainly across northern Italy and really beyond that. Then you can see some of those other drought concerns as you move across into parts of Central Asia. So that is a bit of a hot spot. Certainly now in the southern areas, we're well into the growing season and then quickly expanding northward through other parts of Southern Europe as the growing season gets underway. Next slide, please. This is kind of a mess. I won't spend too much time here, but I'm just looking here at last 3 months of precipitation, standardized precipitation index. And it does draw your eye a little bit to the central and southern Great Plains. In the north central part or the upper middle part of the map here, you can see that hot spot there, the Iberian Peninsula into Northwest Africa. And you can see some of the issues in Central Asia. And so just a little bit of a focus there on some of the drier spots as we head into the Northern Hemisphere growing season. Next slide. All right, here's the bulk of what I want to say today, talking about what suddenly appears to be an impending, imminent El Nino. Now, a couple of months ago, it looked like we might eventually transition into El Nino by the end of the year, but all of a sudden, it seems like this El Nino is really ramping up very and unexpectedly quickly, and that could have impacts for the June, July, August period as we move into the heart of the 2023 growing season. This set of more than 24 dynamical and statistical models shows an extremely high likelihood of El Nino developing in the next few months, as you can see by the number of models that are showing points above that red line that is the El Nino threshold for surface ocean temperatures in the equatorial Pacific. Next slide, please. So by June, July, August, we have a 75% likelihood of El Nino formation. Again, that's unusually early for El Nino, which often develops in the fall or heading toward the cold season. In fact, we're at a 60+% chance of El Nino development as early as the May, June, July time period. So again, increasing odds that we could see influence of El Nino on this Northern Hemisphere growing season within weeks to months. Next slide, please. So how does that play out into some of the forecasts? The International Research Institute for Climate in New York City indicating that it is going to be a warm summer pretty globally. When you see El Nino, that tends to take that warmth over the equatorial Pacific and move it throughout the atmosphere in time. And that's one of the reasons we're expecting a very warm forecast. You see some of the hot spots for heat expected in 2023, June, July, August, Mexico, perhaps southern part of the United States, certainly down into Central America, the Caribbean, northern South America. Also look at North Africa, parts of southern Europe, and then extending into South Asia and even perhaps southern China, and of course, Southeast Asia. So pretty warm forecast there for the summer. Hot, certainly heat a big concern in some areas during the growing season. The next slide will show precipitation prospects, and just draw your eyes to a couple of the potential drought spots due to the rapid El Nino development. One would be in the southern part of North America, including parts of Mexico, and then into Central America, northern South America, and the Caribbean. There's also a drought possibility to likelihood for South Asia. So if you look from the subcontinent and then on into parts of Southeast Asia, that is, again, a consideration for likelihood of drought development. Also kind of a conflicting signal. You see the African Sahel region expecting a wet summer. It means a lot of thunderstorm complexes moving westward into the Atlantic, but then a hostile environment for tropical formation. So a lot of question marks as to how that tropical moisture will or won't reach the United States and the Caribbean, expected to kind of rip apart anything that tries to form. And so if that moisture reaches the United States in disorganized format, that's actually really good news, but a lot of question marks on how that's going to play out with an active African subcontinent and then a dry Caribbean, kind of an interesting setup there. Next slide. And this is more of a generalized look at what you expect when El Nino forms early and does affect that June, July, August timeframe. And this is pretty close to what you saw in the actual forecast. Again, this is that generalized sort of the historical record of what happens in the summer when El Nino forms early. You can expect drought for India, for the South Asian subcontinent. Also expect drought in much of Southeast Asia. That'll eventually extend into Australia following 3 very good years there. And then as you move to the east, you can expect that dry signal for parts of Central America, perhaps extending into Mexico, the Caribbean, northern South America. But then as we look at South America, the signal should flip from the drought we've been experiencing there. So we may be able to knock down the drought in Argentina and southern Brazil. Anyway, I believe that was my last slide, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. Look forward to hearing everybody else.
Brad, thanks so much. This is really great, and we're likely to have you back just as we follow this development, because I think this will be critical, particularly for Southern Hemisphere, some of the Southern Hemisphere crops. Okay, so now we're going to turn away from the sort of crop condition weather side of things to some of the actual supply and demand things. So first, let me welcome Angie. Setzer, Angie, it's all yours.
Thank you. I'll wait for the production to start and we'll get rolling. All right, I am Angie Setzer and I'm here with your 2023 production outlook for the US and Canada. Let's go ahead to the next slide. All right, so I'm here with what we have as a starting point. I mean, all of this is very initial data, and the figures discussed by me today came from the Government of Canada's Agricultural and Agri-Food Canada's March Outlook update. We'll get a survey-derived piece of information from StatsCan next week, so we'll be watching for that. US data came from March 31st Planning Intentions Report, and I'm going to kind of fill some of that in with the 2023 Ag Outlook info that the USDA provided us in February. And so kind of at the start, some points of interest that I want to mention. Both the US and Canada are kind of moving away from what we've seen from a trend standpoint, at least for now. Both are expecting principal acreage to be up year over year. So it's been kind of an interesting sort of dynamic that we've seen over the last few years with discussion on whether or not we would ever see principal acreage really kind of meet the previous year's level, you know, due to certain factors at play, urban sprawl, other things that have been kind of tapping into acreage in both the US and Canada. Weather is always, you know, we just went through 2 different weather outlooks, and that's going to have the final say. The breakdown in La Nina is seen as somewhat beneficial, or at least has been, just simply because La Nina has been so rough. It feels like over the last 3 years when it comes to production, but with this rapid sort of shift into El Nino, I feel like we still have no idea what to expect, or at least feel like it could be a bit of a wild card this year. So One of the best things or one of the good things that we've seen so far is lower production costs with prices remaining somewhat elevated. Have farmers optimistic for the growing season. They're very eager to get started and are going into it with a pretty positive attitude, which is always helpful. Yields are expected to improve in the U.S. after last year's drought, hoping to kind of work on what is hopefully a better weather pattern because we had such a significant drought in the Western Corn Belt last year. But in Canada, they're not really anticipating another repeat of last year on the production side or on the yield side, simply because we had record yields across much of the country, and that's going to prove difficult to repeat most likely. Next slide. So just kind of breaking down our Canadian expectations a little bit more pointedly. Ending stocks are anticipated to grow again for all principal field crops this year. Durham area is expected to fall slightly, but wheat acres outside of Durham are expected to be up in Canada as well as in the US. Production and carryout is expected to increase for both wheat and durum when it comes to Canadian production and ending stock outlooks. Their corn area is expected to decline 2% from last year. A lot of corn in Canada is grown in the eastern portion of the country, Ontario and Quebec. And they had such a great fall last year when it came to seeding wheat and the prices were good. So of course that kind of cut into some of that corn area we would typically see. Overall, coarse grain acreage is expected to fall about 6% year over year. Barley is going to be the only thing that really sees an acreage increase, and that's been driven by some cash market moves we've seen. Oilseed acreage in the country is expected to be up by about 2%, with big jumps expected in canola and soybean outlooks. Go ahead and next slide. As everyone else, Brad had mentioned, we're really kind of watching soil moisture with some worries over what's taking place in Western Canada. The forecast here for the last half of April should help to really kind of bolster at least some of that soil moisture into the seedbed ahead of planting. Next slide. So here, just to touch on U.S. acres, we've got corn acres up just under 3.5 million from last year. They came in at about 1 million acres higher than Ag Outlook projections and a little bit above trader expectations. Soybean acres are similar to last year's final acreage and in line with the Ag Outlook expectations at 87.5 million. Well, wheat acres were up again. We found another 1 million acres in the area report, the planting intentions report there released at the end of March. A lot that was winter wheat area acreage, and a lot of that was found in Kansas. So it'll be really interesting to see, just simply because of a lot of the expansion or much of the expansion that we've seen in expected wheat area has been driven by winter wheat, and some of that was the hard red winter in the southern plains. And then over to cotton. Cotton area is down 2.7 million from last year. That decline's expected based on the economics. I mean, cotton really just doesn't pencil into a farmer's P&L really well right now. Next one, please. So just to kind of do, I'll say a fun exercise, because I enjoy looking at all of the different ways that things could change as we go forward. But I like to take, and a lot of other traders are doing the same, where we're taking our area planted based on the USDA numbers, USDA historical percentage of harvest, trendline yield as presented in Ag Outlook Forum. I've adjusted beginning stocks to reflect our current outlook from the April numbers, and then just kind of fed in the numbers that the USDA had released in the Ag Outlook Forum to get an idea as to what we could expect to see in the initial new crop supply and demand projection that will be released next month. And so as you can see here, we're looking at a pretty significant potential increase in corn ending stocks, probably one of the higher ending stock numbers that we've seen, the highest since the 1920 crop year. And while there's a long way to go before we get there, it's definitely something that we'll want to keep in mind. Next slide. Same sort of exercise here with our bean outlook. Took the USDA planting intentions numbers, utilized the Ag Outlook Forum demand numbers, trendline yield, and that put us in a situation that kind of shows that soybeans don't have much room for error still this year. You could say minimum pipeline stocks are in that 200 million bushel range. And so really, if you see any sort of shift in area, shift in acres, shift in demand, we could see a pretty significant swing in ending stock expectations. Next slide. And here you have wheat. To be completely honest, I would not get married to this outlook simply because I think we're going to see some pretty substantial changes in overall production outlook, potentially some significant increases in abandonment due to the drought that we're seeing in the Southern Plains, and a lot of other factors at hand that are going to really kind of change this outlook. But having said that, it does show that if all things line up, which is a big question or is a big if, but if it does, we would see a slight increase in ending stocks year over year. Next slide, please. So just kind of a quick run through of the other U.S. crops. Sorghum acres are expected to be lower this year due to increased wheat plantings, but as I said, wheat abandonment and continued drought could really change that moving forward. Weather always has the final say. The small grains acreage outlook is mixed. We're supposed to see a small increase in oat area, which is interesting in and of itself because it's kind of the area increases are in states you would not necessarily expect: Iowa, Nebraska, Oklahoma. Barley acres are expected to come in slightly below last year. Durum acreage is expected to come in higher this year thanks to big gains in North Dakota, while rice, canola, and peanuts are also going to see a planting increase, while sugar beets and overall sunflowers will come in lower. Next slide, please. So just kind of a historical run through in corn and soybeans. Corn acres have a tendency of increasing. We've seen corn acres increase 15 out of the last 22 years from March intentions, especially if we have a fast planting pace. There's no real historical correlation on soybean acres from March to June. We've honestly, 10 years, we've seen an increase in acreage in June, 3 years unchanged, 9 years lower. So a lot of that's just heavily influenced by weather and how the rest of the planting season wraps up. Corn acre adjustments tend to be kind of muted. They fall under 2 million acres most of the time. Well, only 2 years out of the last 16 have we seen them exceed that 2 million acre mark. Whereas in soybeans, we've had 6 years out of the last 16 with an adjustment greater than 2 million. So trendline yields, one last thing I'd like to comment on. Trendline yields have been difficult to accomplish the last several years, and so we kind of have a tendency to believe that this year will be no different. So last slide, please, or next slide. In conclusion, like I said, this is just a starting point. We've got many factors that will influence final production, and the market psychology regarding that's going to shift probably significantly many times in the coming year. March acreage and subsequent June data are both derived from farmer surveys. And so I would just kind of be aware of the fact that some of that lower level of response can result in the potential for a major shift in our outlook from March to final, something to really kind of be aware of. Economic incentives are definitely there for farmers to work to maximize production this year. And so we've seen a really decent April. The last half of the month looks poor. We'll be looking ahead to see how May plays out to really get a feel for how that planting season will finish. And then, of course, the plains remain our biggest point of worry. Northern states are still seeing they have been seeing delayed snow melt and are experiencing cold temperatures, while the drought remains prevalent in the south. So that is it, and I thank you.
Angie, thanks so much. I want to remind everyone that we are going to have a question and answer period after this, so submit your questions on IFPRI.org, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or the hashtag AskIFPRI on Twitter. Okay, so great. We're going to now switch continents. We're going to move across the Atlantic Ocean, and Aurélien is going to lead us through what's going on in Europe and North Africa. Thanks.
Okay, so thanks for the opportunity to present. So I'm working as a crop analyst for Stratégie grain, and together with 2 other colleagues. So we are responsible for crop production forecast. So in Europe and Black Sea region countries. So today I will give a quick overview about outlook. So in Europe and in some North African countries. So next slide, please. So just to begin, a few words about the context of this 2023 harvest. So while last year, high prices for commodity secure in some ways, so the margin for farmers. So the situation is a little different this year with a real favorable price Sizov effect for this new harvest. with on the one hand, so higher operating costs than last year. And on the other hand, so the price of commodities that have been decreasing over the last few months. So more than ever, so farmers will have to navigate between maintaining their yield objective, but also ensuring the financial viability of the business with this year, so vulnerability in case of extreme weather events that will lower the yield, for example. So next slide, please. So yeah, moving without transition to our production forecast. So on the left, there's a map representing, with the figures representing the production forecast, which is the 2023 harvest. And the color code refers to the evolution compared to the 5-year average. So green increasing, red decreasing. So starting with rapeseed, so we forecast a slight increase for rapeseed production year on year. So this is fueled by an increase in acreage, also in the Western Europe, notably in France and Germany, with incentive price at the time of sowing and relative good weather condition that did not impede the realization of sowing intention. We had also a quite mild winter with few report of crop losses, and so far okayish condition during the first day or weeks of flowering. So altogether, so we are set for production at 21 million tons for the total EU 27 and plus the UK this year. So 21 million tons with a possible upward production potential, given the good conditions so far. So next slide, please. So for soft wheat, again, crop rating satisfactory overall, with the return of rain in France and southeastern Europe. So in March, that eased the tension. So after a very dry winter. So the only red flag, the major red flag that we see, so in terms of crop conditions, will be Spain and Portugal, where we already penalized yield with a possible additional production loss that are possible. So we'll come later with a slide on Spain specifically. So altogether, so with an acreage that is forecast slightly up compared to last year and better prospects in the southeastern part of Europe. So production for soft wheat, so it set at 143.8 million tons this year. Next slide, please. For barley, so production is set stable compared to last year. So here, so the situation is a bit different in terms of acreage between winter barley and spring barley. So for winter barley, so we estimate an acreage up 2% compared to last year, with so far so satisfactory crop rating in most of Europe, so except the Iberian Peninsula. For spring barley, so the picture is a bit different, with an acreage that is estimated down again this year after 2022 crops was already at a low level in terms of acreage. So in terms of things to follow, so maybe the sowing that were a little bit delayed, so in the northern part of Europe, with rainy and rather cold condition. So there's something to follow how things develop, and it put the crop maybe in a greater risk in terms of high temperature during the late stage of crop development. Yeah, next slide, please. So yeah, we come back now a little bit on Spain. So here, so early springtime, so did not bring any relief in terms of precipitation, with cumulative precipitation between October and beginning of April at a high deficit, with crop conditions that is now set critical in the northern and eastern part of the countries. So here, in terms of production forecast, so we are still slightly above the 2022 harvest, which was a bad harvest. But given that little to no rain, so the forecast in the coming days we are most likely going to reduce again the potential yields. So you can count with a reduction in terms of forecast for both soft wheat, total barley, and also durum wheat that is not included here. So the durum wheat, which it has a time, so the most impacted crops with a lot of acreage in Andalusia. Next slide, please. So further south, so the situation is also critical in North Africa, with again drought building up. So in Morocco, Algeria, and also in Tunisia. So the situation is maybe at the direst in Tunisia, where there have been reports of fields that have been put already to grazing, so for durum wheat, and irrigation bans that has been enforced since early April. So condition is still set. We already penalized yield potential, but again, as it is the case for Spain, as no rain is forecasting the coming days, production has a potential to go down again. Next slide, please. So together, so it is a real slump in production that is expected in North Africa, where the biggest decrease expected in Tunisia. For all the winter cereals that I reported here, so soft wheat, barley, and durum wheat. So altogether, so the production of the three countries combined is set as it is now, slightly above against the 2022 harvest, so the bad harvest, with yield and acreage loss that have been taken. We've reduced yield and acreage loss that have been taken into account. But again, as for Spain, so the production of the potential to go down again. Next slide, please. So now moving quickly to spring crop production forecast. So starting with maize, so maize production is set to rebound at a catastrophic 2022 harvest. So this increase is actually masking an acreage that is expected down year on year on the main production in the main producing countries, so notably in Hungary and France, where the possible lack of access to irrigation water has certainly played a role into declining soil intention. In terms of things to follow, so maybe we have a rather rainy cold start to the campaigns in Central and Southeastern Europe. So maybe to follow to see things all develop so far. At the time, the production is set at 62.7 million tons. Next slide, please. And yeah, finishing with spring oilseed crop forecast. So here, this is a record high level of production that are expected for both sunflower and soybean production, with acreage levels that remain very high, so slightly up. So estimated for soybean slightly up, for sunflower slightly down, with yields that are at this time expected much higher compared to the bad 2022 crops. So the production could reach 11.2 million tons for sunflowers and 3.2 million tons for soybean. Next slide, please. So yeah, to finish, to wrap it says. So in terms of key points, so favorable conditions so far for winter crops, so mostly in Western and Central European countries. So possible upward in terms of production potential compared to the estimate I gave. So it will be the opposite for the production estimate I gave for Spain and North Africa, where we could possibly revise onward the production. In terms of things to follow, maybe this spring sowing that has been delayed in northern part of Europe for spring barley, a little bit in Poland also, and for maize in southern Europe to see how things develop and if the crop will not be put at risk in the later stage of development. And then, yeah, the access to irrigation flowers for access to irrigation water for summer crop in France that is put again into question with a very low groundwater reserve. But something to follow. That's it for me. So thanks for your attention. Next slide, please.
Great. Thanks. We're going to continue our movement east. So Andrey, if you can turn now to Russia and the Black Sea. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. I'm Andrey Sizov, head of SovEcon, editor of Sizov Report on the Black Sea. We help people to understand what's happening in this volatile and not transparent region, help funds, traders, large millers to understand what's happening here, to understand what the crop going to be, will we see any disruptions in this region, which could lead to limit up or limit down in the global wheat market, or perhaps even corn market. I encourage you to have a look at our service, Sizov.report, and get your free trial to understand what we are doing. I will speak briefly about the crop in Russia and Ukraine and finish with a few slides dedicated to S&Ds of those countries. So a quick reminder where Russia grows its wheat. It's 70% out of total crop, winter wheat. The rest is spring wheat. So it's south, central, and Volga Valley. And then on top of that, Russia grows a lot of spring wheat, and that's more to the east, Urals and Siberia, and also Volga Valley. So if we talk about the crop outlook for this year, we saw again a substantial decline in winter crops area. It's not only winter wheats, it's other crops like rape, for example. No data is available, but wheat typically accounts for around 90% of total area. We saw another substantial decrease because of the weather and because of the export tax you might have heard about, which was introduced in 2021, and which does hurt a lot farmers PL in Russia, particularly wheat farmers, and this one is the reason why they really declined this year, last year, prior to this crop again. We talked about the weather a lot, and I do enjoyed earlier presentation dedicated to the weather. So overall, the weather was, if we talk about Russia, more or less okay. There were some problems with ice crust, but not as big as usual. And if you look, if you might remember the previous map with wheat production, here's this nice green area. It overlaps with key winter wheat regions, southern Russia, central Russia, Volga Valley. Volga Valley has been a bit dry, as you can see here, but they had earlier quite good precipitation. If you look at moisture reserves now, they are in the Volga, in the center, they are above average. In south, they are close to average or slightly above. We had some concerns about the south, and that's the key growing wheat region and particularly winter wheat region. But starting from late February, they started to receive good precipitation, and we just revised the crop forecast, as you probably could saw just on Reuters and Bloomberg. I think I'll skip this. So if you talk about area, we expect to see, because of smaller winter wheat area, we expect to see smaller pre-harvest area for winter wheat this season, which will be partly offset by somewhat bigger spring wheat area, but perhaps the number for spring wheat area would be even lower, because right now or in recent months, farmers are very unhappy with wheat prices inside Russia in ruble terms. Input prices are going up, while the domestic prices, in many cases, they are close to break even, or in some cases below the break even. So farmers could try to switch to some other crops if they can to. So we currently use still marginally below the trend yield estimate. And with such area and that yield, we expect to Russia to harvest around 87 million tons of wheat. That is area, it's important to end, that has been controlled, was controlled in Russia prior to the war, so it doesn't include those 4 Ukrainian regions. But as officially, it does include Crimea. For example, Crimea last year produced 1.2 million tons. So you should deduct around 1 million from this number, roughly, to get an idea what Russia could produce, excluding Crimea. So it's substantial drop, but at the same time, it's close to average, as you can see here. Ukraine, a reminder where Ukraine grows its grain. So southern Ukraine and partly central Ukraine, it's wheat. It's mainly a winter wheat contract Russian, 98% it's winter wheat. And corn is northern Ukraine and central Ukraine. So if we talk a bit about Ukraine, we should add a few words about the war. So, for example, Russia currently controls a large part of southern eastern Ukraine, as you can see here, and that's mainly wheat regions. Here, that's mainly corn regions, no Russian troops here, and that's important to be in mind if you look at how this war will develop. So, for example, last year when Russian forces had to pull out of central and northern Ukraine, it did help Ukrainian farmers a lot to harvest late crops like corn and sunflower. Ukraine wheat area is substantially down because of the war, because of that southeastern part of country which is not being controlled by Ukraine at the moment. So we expect it to decline by around 1 million hectares. To 4.1 million hectares. Again, this chart, this map, you saw it already, but Brian mentioned that Ukraine has been a bit dry. Yes, it was, but just in recent 2 weeks, things have improved substantially in southwestern part of the country, which received good precipitation, as you can see here, particularly Odessa region, which was too dry, and that's a #1 wheat grower in Ukraine, had received very good precipitation, and that substantially improved the outlook for Ukrainian winter wheat crop and total crop, wheat crop. So now we can see some dryness here in Zaporozhye, which is controlled by Russia by now, but other regions, moisture reserves are close to average or above, with some exceptions in very southwestern part of the country. We expect Ukraine to produce around 18 million tons of wheat compared to 20 million tons in the previous year, and that's another big decline compared to the record crop harvested in 2021. But for the because of the war conditions, still a very decent crop. We expect Ukraine to cut corn area by 0.6 million hectares. That's a noticeable decline because of the war, because corn is more demanding crop compared to wheat, compared to barley, and needs more inputs, and fertilizer probably is biggest concern for the next crop, but also because Ukrainian farmers, I think in many cases, would prefer to plant other late spring crops, not corn, but sunflower. For example, Ukraine has been harvesting all corn crop just until recently, while they harvested all the sunflower in the previous year. And sunflower just a more profitable crop for Ukrainian farmers and gives a bit better returns per acre for Ukrainian farmers. We expect to see another decline of corn production in Ukraine from, sorry, the title is wrong, we just updated that forecast, from 28 million tons the previous year to 23 million tons this year. Another big decline, but still a very good crop, taking account that conditions the country is facing right now and farmers are facing now. So with such inputs, just, and that probably should be the biggest takeaway out of my short presentation, we expect to see a substantial decline in Russian production, but because of huge crop, record high crop last year, we expect to see Russia to have huge record high carry out this season, which goes into carry in for the new season. And with average crop, Russian wheat crop, we still expect to see a huge supply of Russian wheat in the new season, just marginally below the previous year, close to the previous year, and that was a record high number, which in turn could imply and is likely to imply that Russia will be a huge wheat exporter again in the new season. And personally, I won't be surprised to see even higher number, or perhaps we can surpass the previous year record, this season record. We say 44.5. USDA says just up to 45 million tons. That's a reasonable number. And next season, we're likely to be closed because of huge carry-in. If we talk about Ukraine, we expect to see a substantial decrease of production, substantial decrease of supply. At the same time, and by now they already mostly got rid of very high stocks they had in previous seasons because of a record high crop in 2021. But still, we expect to see exports going out of Ukraine. We expect to see wheat exports at around 10.5 million tons compared to 15.5 million tons in the current season. And corn exports, we expect them to decline to around 17 million tons compared to 29 million tons this season. And this, among other things, implies that for Ukraine, export terminals will be less important in the new season because of lower export volumes, which country will likely to have to export in the new season. This is all for me. Again, I encourage you to have a look at our report, Sizov.report, and I'm happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Great. Seth, I'm going to turn it over to you, but I remind everyone that send those question and answer or questions to the on either IFPRI.org, Facebook, LinkedIn, or YouTube, or the hashtag AskIFPRI on Twitter. Seth, take it away.
All right, and I'll bring Erin in as well too. Erin has graciously allowed me to ask the first open-ended question, and I think this might be for all five of you, which is, I'll take note of Joe's introduction where he talks a lot about some of the uncertainties coming in, and we bounce around with you into the U.S. and into Europe and into the Black Sea region. We talk about weather. I'm not known as an optimist here, so maybe that's just how I'm coming off. But do you all think has the market priced in some of these uncertainties? I mean, Angie, you talk about some of the returns to more normal yields, and yet, which I think is optimistic for wheat, and yet we still seem pretty tight on some of these stocks. And in Europe, we've got some tightness in terms of Southern Europe. And then on Ukraine, we see another leg down in production and good crops in Russia, but maybe some uncertainty about the flow of grain out of the region. So I guess my question for anybody who wants to talk about, is the market priced in all these uncertainties, or am I just too much of a worry wart on this thing?
I can start a little bit there because this has been a common conversation that I've had among other merchandiser friends and myself. We're kind of like, where is the risk premium in this market structure for what's taking place? And so I would say there's a couple different things that are important to pay attention to. First off, the cash grain market, the cash values, the physical market around the world are not indicating that we're tight on much of anything. You know what I mean? Like the physical market structure and the cash market prices are substantially lower than what we were seeing directly after the invasion and in the months leading up to it. And so that's kind of the biggest thing that I'm looking at right now, is that the physical market structure in and of itself isn't necessarily indicating that we need to have additional risk premium. But the question comes into play, and then I will quit talking. But the question comes into play for me is, what kind of additional speculator fluff do we get? That additional flow of money that we've been seeing over the last 3 years has a pretty substantial influence on just how high the markets can move. And so if hedge funds and other speculators just really aren't caring too much about the grain story, do we see this market just kind of stay flat until we know more or discover that there is a worry? And so that's the biggest thing I look at. I keep going back to like 2019 when the speculators weren't actively involved in the ag markets. And 2019 was when we had threatened the crop, and probably in the US crop in the most epic of ways, the greatest threat to production since 2012. And we topped out at 473 on the D's board that year. And so that's one of those things that I tend to worry about is, are we transitioning away from deep hedge fund participation in this market to one of a more normal hedge fund participation, or we just kind of stay a little bit neutral until more is known? And I think that could have an influence on just how deep that risk premium gets.
All right. Aurélien, Andrey, Brad?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Andrey.
Yeah, so risk premium, when we talk about risk premium, and Angie mentioned that, I mean, in my view, it does make a lot of sense that we are currently looking at global S&D, which is not 100% accurate, as we well know, but still, at least it could be comparable to the previous year, or it's tighter. And at the same time, there is still a war going on. Ukraine has to ship around 10, 11 million tons of corn and wheat in the current season. Russia has to ship around 12 or 14 million tons of wheat in the current season. And, you know, we hear the stories about the Black Sea grain deal almost every day. There is still a war, a lot of talks about potential Ukrainian counteroffensive and how it will impact the grain flows out of the region. So, and taking all that into account, I mean, it does, in my view, it does make a lot of sense that, particularly I'm talking about wheat, that it's so cheap. We also could, at the same time, fundamentally, we can look at other things. And for example, the EU S&D is very heavy, contrary to what USDA has been telling us all the season. And we see that rallies are being sold in massive, but with that huge risk in the Black Sea. Okay, that's my primary area of focus, of course, but you know, there are more than 20 million tons to be shipped this season, and there is a war in that region. That, to summarize things, and wheat is just below $7 per bushel, does make a lot of sense in my view.
Yeah, and even we look at implied volatility on the U.S. futures market as well too. There's no, I mean, it just, you know, I was having a conversation and everybody kept talking about price volatility, and I pointed to the options market. It's not there. It's not there. Aurélien, you want to, what do I pick up on your view of risks within the European market and more broadly?
Yes, I'm basically a crop prediction specialist, so I won't have much to say about the price to add about what you said, just because I put the emphasis in the presentation on things that were red flagged, so situation in Spain and in North Africa, but actually in the upper part of Europe, so crop perspective is looking quite good. So there is compared to our estimate, so there is potential to go upward in that direction. That's just something I wanted to add. Yeah.
Okay, no, that's great. So while you have concerns in the South, the North may has at least the opportunity to make up for it in terms of good production conditions. Hey, Brad, I want to bring you into this conversation quick because, you know, I think a few weeks ago when I'm watching snow in North Dakota, you know, and Angie brought up 2019, so I got to bring up 2019 as well too, and think about prevent plant. What do you think about the risks? You know, we talk about when NASS puts out its prospective planning report, it's always based upon kind of a quote normal prevent plan. What do you think about conditions relative to a normal prevent plant? Because I know it's warmed up.
Sure. Yeah. In the north central United States, we have a more localized problem than what we saw in 2019. So we had a much more widespread flooding issue in 2019. Remember, at some point it consumed the Ohio, the Mississippi, and the Missouri basin. This spring, we're looking at a much more focused area that's mainly North Dakota, northeastern South Dakota, and parts of Minnesota. Sure, that's a big area for sugar beets, for spring wheat, and for eventually for corn and soybeans in that region. But I don't expect the widespread issues that we saw in 2019. Yes, prevent plant acreage could be quite high in, say, eastern North Dakota, western Minnesota, right along that Red River Valley. Maybe that extends a little bit down the Mississippi, down parts of the Missouri tributaries. But again, not quite at the level of a 2019 unless things get really stormy really quick this spring. Not expecting to see that.
All right. Thanks. I feel better. I feel less pessimistic than maybe I started that conversation with. Erin, I'm going to kick it over to you, and I'm going to remind folks, hey, send in your questions. And Erin, I'm going to jump over and look at the questions coming in, and I'll pass it to you.
Okay, great. Thanks. So I'm going to kind of try to stay on that theme a little bit in terms of risks and the market, and taking into consideration, especially from a weather condition or weather and crop conditions perspective. We had one question from the audience already about longer term deterioration in weather conditions in terms of the El Nino patterns, especially in the U.S. Do you see a link to climate change with those patterns? And I guess I would add to that question, especially with La Nina last 3 years and now El Nino coming up this summer, with climate change, do those patterns are those becoming greater considerations in the market? Is the magnitude amplifying as time goes on, or are those patterns already well defined and staying within the measures within the market? So I open that question. That's also, I guess, would be curious to hear that from Brad, Brian, Angie as well on the U.S. perspective.
Yeah, I could jump in real quick since I'm still unmuted from the last question. Certainly, we've seen a change in how the ENSO patterns have played out, especially in the 21st century. We've seen pretty dramatic warming globally over the last half century, and things really seem to be amped up in the last quarter century. We've actually seen more La Ninas than we've ever seen before. When we saw the triple dip La Nina over the last 3 winters, that's only the 3rd time we've seen that going back to the mid 20th century. We saw it back in the mid 70s. We saw it from 98 to 2001, and then we saw it from 2020 to 2022. That usually leads to increased drought coverage in the United States, and that certainly happened in 2020 to 2022. But now it appears we're heading into El Nino very quickly. So a lot of volatility in this ENSO pattern, and maybe a little bit more unpredictable than what we've seen in the past, maybe more surprises in the weather. And certainly a hotter climate, not just in the United States, but globally.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of duration of the patterns, is there any change there, or?
We have seen more frequent La Ninas since over the last 3 decades or so. So this is the first time we've seen El Nino since 2018-19, which was that wet spring of 2019. The difference this time is we're coming off 3 years of drought. So it's going to take a while to get things to the wet point that we saw in 2019. That's why I don't think we'll see as extensive flooding this year.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, to add to that, are the effects of these weather patterns, are they more long lasting than just a season alone? Or do they, I think you kind of just reference to that. Does it take a while for the soil moisture to recover from these events, or is it only season?
We really have seen these extensive multi-year droughts in the 21st century, not just in the US but globally. And I think that's really played out mostly across the western and central United States. We've got the mega drought going in the western US, really 23, 24 years at this point. Yes, it's been interrupted by occasional wet years like what we saw last winter, but overarching drought in the West has been a huge part of the equation. That has extended to the central and southern Great Plains. It's been a rough ride for producers in the central and southern Great Plains. It's been a tough time. I hear from farmers all the time, like, when is this going to end? When are we going to get through this volatility? So it's a real challenge. But at the same time, the Midwest has been largely immune from these major droughts, with the exception of 2012.
Great, thanks.
Erin, just a few comments about the Black Sea and global warming. I had the slide with, I won't get back to it, with winter wheat and spring wheat area. So far, the Black Sea as a whole has been a big beneficiary of the global warming. If we're talking about recent decades, we saw a way bigger, for example, in Russia, we saw way bigger wheat crop, as you well know. And that was largely driven by big winter wheat area, which was pushing spring area, and winter wheat area is typically higher yielding varieties. And that was quite beneficial for Russia as a wheat producer. Ukraine at the same time had got an ability to produce more corn because it had enough warmth during the summer. to grow the corn. And if you talk about recent decades, it has been very beneficial, I would say, for the whole region. But if we just, I'm not a climatologist, but if we just extrapolate this trend, I'm not sure that in 2 decades or 3 decades, it will be still a beneficial factor for the region, because we could just, the trend could reverse and we could see that more and more droughts in the region, and it will be too warm. So it was warm and it was better, but I think things could change.
And Andrey, also not just in terms of necessarily yields, but also quality of crops as well. I imagine also being kind of impacted by the different differences, the changes in the temperatures as well.
Not directly, indirectly, yes. Typically, spring wheat has a low yield, higher quality, so on average quality somewhat declined, but at the same time we do see more pests go into more northern regions because of warmer winters. We see more mice in the fields because of warmer winters. For example, Sunni bug, bug damage, that's an insect which damages the grain. That array has expanded substantially, and that does worsen the quality of the new crop, but it's not really a direct impact. Yields are more important and total area.
Okay, great, thanks. And then Aurélien, just to get your input on this, especially for, I guess, Northern Africa, where they've had, subsequent years of dryness there, in terms of the impact going into next season, will the crops be able to recover already next season, or is the impact of the dryness the last couple of years already having an impact going into next season as well?
Yeah, I'm not an expert of Northern African country, but maybe back to Europe, to France and Spain. So the discussion is on about crop rotation, if farmers could adapt and maybe change a little bit crop rotation decision. It's something that happened after the very bad crops that were in 2022 with extreme dryness and high temperature at the end of the cropping season. So this year, farmers move in France, but also in other parts of Europe, in southeastern country, also to more winter crops, and tend to reduce the maize acreage, for example. So this kind of redistribution in crop rotation could happen. I think this impact also this extreme variability in kind of the higher occurrence, I would say, of extreme weather events that is. I think linked also to this global idea of climate change, or this kind of events will tend to happen more frequently in the coming years. Will farmers will be able to adapt, and how? That is an open question, but is a discussion that is actually at this time open in France about access to irrigation water. So this kind of issue is I think directly linked to your comment on climate change. Yes.
Great. Okay, thanks. Seth, I'll kick it back to you.
Yeah, so I guess when I was listening to the 3 analysts come in and talk, I noticed quite a bit of a contrast from a producer's perspective. And I think about back in this past year, when I think about U.S. producers and USDA's reporting of farm income, a really good year for farm income, but not without a lot of anxiety in terms of, hey, where are input prices headed? Where are output prices headed? So ended up in a good place, but with a lot of anxiety. And I'm asking all 3 of because I think each of these 3 regions has a different perspective. Angie, you seem pretty optimistic about input prices moderating, even if output prices are moderating too. In Europe, very different perspective, perhaps, in terms of input prices and perspective. And then Andrey, a monster crop that you've got out there in terms of Russian production, the Ukrainian farmers struggling perhaps with inputs as well too. So I'm going to make you do double duty and talk about both your perception for inputs and producer attitudes in Ukraine and Russia. So let's start in Ukraine and Russia, and Andrey, since I'm making you do double duty. Tell me about kind of that input-output price spread, both in Russia and Ukraine.
So I'll start with Russia. It's simpler for me. So As I mentioned, in many cases, so we have, in Russia, there is a very strict export tax, which was introduced in 2021, so prior to the war. And currently, around 1/3 of farmer revenue is being taken out of his pocket by that tax. So prices now just $110, $120 per ton at the farm gate, and that's a very low price. And indeed, for farmers, they're just not making money. And the problem is that not making money, not with wheat only, other many all cash crops, all important crops are being heavily taxed. So it's not only wheat, it's also corn, it's also barley, it's also sunflower, it's also rape, it's also soybeans. Everything is taxed. So at the same time, getting back to inputs question, at the same time, prices are rising fast, around, I think, 30% for the previous season, and I think around 20% for the current season, input prices in ruble terms. Fertilizers, like Russia is a big producer and the government tries to relate it. Fertilizer price more or less stable, but at the same time, crop protection is up. Machinery is up heavily, and I think that's the fastest rising type of input because some companies pulled out of Russia, like Deere and Eco. Some are still here. You can get some spare parts, but you can get them via some complicated logistical schemes, and that is way, way more expensive than it was a year ago and 2 years ago. So yes, input prices are up, and P&L for Russian farmers doesn't look good at all. So, and if you look at different parts of the country, southern Russia, huge margins 2-3 years ago, central Russia, huge margins 2-3 years ago. But if you look at the Volga Valley and places like Urals to eastern part of Russia, margins were quite thin there 2 years ago, and now I think many farmers are not making any money. For Ukraine, I think I can't say how much inputs have increased. They did increase of all, first of all, and I think for Ukraine, my guess, seeds and crop protection won't be such an issue, but fertilizer is likely to be a big problem because you need just physically way more fertilizer, and it's hard to deliver during the war. And that's one problem. And more importantly, Russia was the biggest and probably almost the only supplier of fertilizer to Ukraine prior to the war. So, and that's why actually we are quite skeptical. We expect to see a decrease in corn area for the current season. At the same time, I think Ukrainian farmers still, because they don't have such taxes like Russia has, they still made quite good money this and previous season despite the war. And that's why we think that we don't see a disastrous crop this year. And let's hope that this war sooner or later will be over, preferably sooner. We could see, I think, there are a lot of talks that's kind of Ukrainian agriculture is ruined and will take decades to recover. I don't think so. I think that in a few years it could recover and will recover relatively fast.
And so I guess I would take your comments contingent on continuation of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, that some end of that would be a totally different story. Is that fair?
We don't know how that end will look like, and if we see the end of that initiative, because, for example, in October previous year, Russia said, we're stopping that initiative, and then 3 days ago they returned to that initiative. So that's one point. So. And basically, I think a lot will depend, for example, on things which are not really on the market radar. For example, who will win the Turkish election? So if it's still Erdogan, I think there is a good chance that initiative stays. And if it's not Erdogan, risks for initiatives are way higher. That's one story. But at the same time, and I specifically mentioned that for Ukraine, because of smaller supply, smaller export surplus, initiative becoming less important now in the new season. Basically, they can do as we see now, and I think those issues they have currently with Poland, Hungary, and other Eastern European countries, I don't think they'll last for long because the EU already said, it's not up to you to decide if we are allowing Ukrainian grain or not. It's Brussels who decides, or all countries who decides. Poland can block Ukrainian grain for a long time. I think that ban will be over soon, which implies if Ukraine still has access to the EU, Eastern EU, and ports in Poland, and more importantly, Romania. Ukraine also has access to the Danube terminals, and they can ship up to 2.5 million tons a month without Odessa terminals. So even the grain, I think that probability is relatively low at this stage, but let's wait for Turkish elections. But even without Odessa terminals, I think Ukraine more or less could ship almost its all export surplus in the new season.
Okay, so we've rationalized production to hit what we can actually do overland or through those other ports. And thanks for covering the issue of, we were getting questions in the Q&A too about the Polish bans on imports. So I'm glad you comment on that and gave your perspective. So Aurélien, when you kind of gave a different perspective on kind of what European producers are seeing in terms of input prices as well too. Do you want to expand on that at all?
Yeah, so actually this slide about the price, the fact that is something that is recurrently discussed, so at least in France, but I guess in other countries also, since the beginning of the campaign. So it started when farmers started to buy the fertilizer in autumn 2022 at a price that was skyrocketing. And yeah, with a commodity price that started to decline. So it's not only fertilizer, it was the most highest increase, but it's also seeds, fuel, and mechanization costs that went higher. So this is a recurrent matters, and now with a declining price in commodity, so it's starting to be discussed more and more. And actually, so in 2022, so during the last campaign, so farmers actually started already to reduce their fertilizer usage, and it seems to be the case also for this new campaign with fertilizer purchase remaining relatively low, even compared to the last year. Even with the price of fertilizer declining during this first 3 months in the year. So that's I would say a hot topic. So it's difficult to say. So what I say about last year also with high commodity prices that ensure relatively good margin for farmers. So it's also a generic statement that in France, for example, that would apply mostly to farmers in the north of the country that made very good crops, and less to farmers in the southern part of the country where they were a little bit more impacted by the drought condition last year. So it was already, I think, difficult for some of the farmers in 2022, and it will be even more difficult this year, I think, to navigate between farmers should maintain what yield objectives they should maintain, and ensuring the financial stability of the business, as I said. So that's I think that's our topic, and it's something that could go sideways, I think, this year.
All right, and Angie, you know my job. Folks don't tend to call me and tell me how great things are, and maybe that feeds into my pessimism. But you started out pretty optimistic in terms of what producers are. They're always excited to get out in the field, but you have to emphasize this a little bit. Are they feeling a little bit better about where input prices are headed, despite maybe softening prices? What's your feel on this? Very different from perhaps what some of the other regions are seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of producers right now, you're seeing some variability in cost outlooks that we didn't have necessarily last year. Last year, we just had a kind of common thread that fertilizer costs were substantially higher than the year prior across the board, whereas this year it's been quite different. I've had a lot of customers that have kind of lagged into their input purchases and are very happy with what we're looking at from a cost standpoint per acre versus a year ago. In some instances, you're looking at $150 to $200 lower in production costs if certain things kind of lined up correctly and taking into consideration some of the other variables that we've seen. In addition to that, with us seeing some of this reduction in especially fertilizer and just the ability to get it, to feel confident in the supply availability is also very helpful. There isn't anyone this year that's like, what is going to happen? Am I going to be able to get my hands on X, Y, or Z? Everyone feels very confident in the supply chain ability to kind of meet what they need. So there's some optimism on that side. And then, of course, we have the additional support through our revenue insurance and through the revenue guarantee that crop insurance provides. And so you saw one of I think the second highest crop insurance revenue guarantee prices established for both corn and soybeans this year. So now farmers are able to, if they participate in crop insurance, they're guaranteeing a certain percentage of their expected production at a $5.91 per bushel on the December corn board. So that's high. You're looking at the upper 13s for soybeans. And so the farmers in the U.S., not only are they looking at some slight reduction in production costs and the ability to get their hands on the products that they've been looking for, or the things that they need, they also have this additional sort of aspect, via the revenue insurance and safety net that they're able to kind of have underneath them to a certain extent. So it does feel like a better year. It's one that is definitely filled with anxiety, but the anxiety is more of, does the shoe drop, as we work our way through the production season, if the crop is good, and do we see a repeat of 13 or, 2008, 2009 with pricing where the opportunities are very heavily front loaded. That anxiety is not going anywhere because high prices eventually change. But from an overall standpoint, when it comes to, looking at a potential P&L for the year ahead, most folks are sitting in a pretty good position, I would say, across the US. If the weather cooperates.
Yeah, exactly. And this kind of gets back to that. Last year was a good year, but a lot of anxiety. So it's a better year just in the reduction of that anxiety about, can I get what I need? So Erin and Joe too, I'd invite you all in. I know we see some questions popping up in the Q&A. They've kind of been woven into folks' responses, but Erin, I'm going to kick it over to you. And Joe, jump in.
Okay. Thanks. I have two quick questions. One's for Angie and one is for Andrey. So I guess first on Angie, following up on kind of what you're just talking about, you briefly kind of referenced wheat abandonment potential in your PowerPoint. Just curious if you could speak a little bit to that, the potential behind that, if there's any economic incentives behind that, or if it's all weather related, if you could just say a couple of things about that.
Yeah, I would say a good portion of it is weather related, though you could say that the price drop that we've seen, I mean, folks were able to plant a good portion of their wheat in the upper 8s to even low 9s. We had rush up a lot of the corridor deal the first week in November there. And we saw a significant surge in price that really kind of prompted. I had customers that called, they're like, I haven't planted wheat in 15 years. I think I'm going to go out and plant it. And I said, well, that's a great plan. However, let's sell it right now. If you're in the process, if you're saying that, there's several other people that are. And so, again, going back to revenue guarantees via crop insurance, if a farmer participates in that in the Eastern Corn Belt, and has a reasonable APH, they're probably going to keep their wheat, especially if they've already kind of decided to do so via, a nitrogen application or something of that nature here that tends to take place in the last part of, or throughout March across much of the US here. So, it's the biggest thing, the weather, the Southern Plains, the wheat that hasn't been irrigated is basically non-existent. Like, it never really had a chance. And so you do have a good amount of those acres that are reported. The farmer did plant them. They did try. There was a shot of moisture, last year, late in the fall, and some talk that we were going to see La Nina break down sooner than later that provided some optimism regarding putting wheat in the ground. And that's not there. And so anything that really hasn't seen significant irrigation over the course of the winter, even, I mean, there were reports of folks running pivots on circles in February. And so if you don't have issues, if you haven't seen, if you don't have wheat under irrigation, you're probably going to run into a situation where it's going to be taken into consideration to just kind of put something else in, or look in a different direction, I would say, across a lot of the Southern Plains.
Mm-hmm. Okay, super interesting. Thanks. And then since we're running out of time, very quickly going to switch to a quick question for Andrey. Andrey, you already kind of touched on some of these topics, but just wanted to ask a little bit about some of the dynamics in Russia in terms of exports and prices. Russia's had these big supplies. It's had a really strong export pace late in the season after a slow pace early in the season, which a little bit atypical. And those trends have been a big driving factor behind bringing global wheat prices down. But there's been a lot of recent developments, some of which you already mentioned, the potential to revise the export tax, which would result in a lower export taxes from Russia, the kind of unofficial price floor that we've heard about coming for Russia's exports, and the recent, as you mentioned, the pullout of a lot of multinational companies from Russia. So just curious if you can speak to, in terms of exports and the impact on global wheat prices that you think those developments might have in the very near future and also going into next season.
Thank you. That's a great question. And this is very uncommon season, as you mentioned well. We had a short, slow start of the campaign because of strong ruble and because of those taxes, which we mentioned. Then pace began to speed up, but because of the slow start, Russia will export almost 50% of its export program in the second half of the season, which is very uncommon. Typically, it's first half of the season, 60-70%, but this year it's 50% or just slightly above 50%. Yeah. So for now, we expect to see strong shipments until the end of the season. But the problem is Russia can ship more than it's shipping now because of infrastructure bottlenecks, first of all. Because of the war, it's hard to deliver grain to terminals because you have those rail cars busy with other things. So we expect to see 44.5 million tons. USDA says 45 million tons. That's a strong pace, but it's more or less, we've been around this number for many months. But it's important to understand, despite huge supplies, despite a not so good outlook for the next crop, Russia can ship more physically because of that bottleneck. Also, it's very interesting that you mentioned that unofficial price floor. We don't know for sure, but it looks like it does exist because at every international tender with public prices, we see that Russian exporters are not offering lower than $275 per ton, and that's quite interesting because in fact it implies that in some cases Russia can compete with other supplies. And with just a recent week, we saw outstanding sales, the data is available. Outstanding sales of Russian wheat are going down. So I won't be surprised that sooner or later either they will get rid of that floor, or the price will go up and Russian wheat will become competitive again. Or, in fact, Russian exports would be low because of that floor. Exporters have huge margins at the moment, just great margins, but they can sell more because of that floor. And that's kind of a new factor, which probably is not priced in if you're talking about the current season. If we talk about next few months, I think Green Deal, Kremlin decision about its own exports, about Ukrainian exports is another factor to watch out. And as I said, Turkish elections are very important. But if we talk about the whole new season, I think, and I said about that already, the biggest takeaway is that Russia will still have a lot of wheat, likely to have a lot of wheat to export despite a substantially smaller crop. That's one point, but same point, all the risks we talked about, Black Sea risk, Russia supplies risk. I won't be surprised that Russia again will try to hint that it somehow could limit its own wheat exports or grain exports, as we saw just some verbal interventions in the recent months. This is quite likely to happen in the next few months and in the new season as well, despite Russia will still have a lot of supplies to ship.
Okay. All right, great. Thanks so much.
Great, Erin. Thanks so much. And thanks, everyone. This was really informative. We got a lot of time left before these crops get harvested. I'm sure we're going to have a lot to talk about over the next few months. We hope to get into a discussion soon on rice as well. So check your calendars and everything. But I just wanted to thank all of you. This has been very, very informative. A great job. And thanks in particular to the production team here at IFPRI, Joanna, And Michael, as usual, you guys have kept this thing running smoothly, and this will be posted and up soon, so you'll be able to watch it at home when you get home. In any event, thanks so much, and we'll conclude.